Morning all. Whoops. Hopefully my mic is still working. Let me just fix that. Wish it would keep the settings better. Okay, there we go. Right, something a bit different this morning. Not going to try and be funny, and normally the whole shtick of the show is that I'm horribly ill-informed and I'm just like off the cuff commenting on the news as it shows up. Shut up, phone. But this morning I'm being deadly serious. So comments and updates and stuff will be dealt with at the end as per usual, but I keep being presented with this dichotomy from people, and it's a false dichotomy, and the dichotomy is that we have to either kill millions through poverty and so on resulting from the shutdown, or kill millions resulting from the virus. These aren't the only two choices on the table, but you wouldn't know it to hear a lot of people talk. So I want to get into that because it's just not true that these are the only choices available to us. The idea behind this is that joblessness and poverty will kill more people than the virus ever could, or at least in the current context, that joblessness and poverty will kill more people than the virus will. And I don't think it is a choice between those two options, killing millions of people from poverty or killing millions of people from the virus, let alone that letting millions of people die from the virus is in any way the better choice of the two here. And I hope to show that today. I'm still not in the habit of showing my citations or anything because nobody ever checks anyway. If I don't, it encourages people to go and do their own research. So I strongly encourage you to do your own research. Now, the tentative mortality rate is about, it's anywhere from 3.1 to 3.4%. But that's fairly tentative because mass testing still isn't particularly on the table yet. Actually, let me preface this with a few other bits before we get into that. Hopefully, if you watch me, you know me. You know I don't just pull arguments out of my arse. You know that I have a grounding in history and politics and political history. You know that I'm an ideological anarchist, so my bias is towards freedom. Now, this confuses a lot of people for some reason, because I'm also a pragmatist, and they can't seem to square my pragmatism with my anarchism. So I think that the ideal is the maximum amount of freedom for the maximum number of people. But like democracy, this relies on an informed and socially conscious populace. Right? So that's an ideological goal. That's a vision. That's a platonic ideal. Right? But pragmatically speaking, we're not in any position to do that. So what of the available systems and options in every political or social case, which one provides the greatest freedom for the greatest number of people? That's my guide, and that's what tends to lead me towards utopian socialism, or non-Marxist socialism, if you like, welfare capitalism, if you insist, because that provides the greatest freedom for the greatest number of people, the greatest opportunity for the greatest number of people. It prevents the most harm, allows people to flower and succeed in society, it allows for the greatest social mobility, all of these other positive things. It does come at a cost, but at a much lower cost than, say, laissez-faire capitalism does, right? And yet it's not a replacement for capitalism. It incorporates, both socialist and capitalist ideas. It's adaptable, it's effective, it's the best option of those currently on the table. There might be some other option in the future, some new ideology, some new way forward, fully automated luxury communism or something, that works better. But for the time being, that's kind of where I'm at. And anarchism, while it prioritizes freedom, differentiates from libertarianism in that it's much more focused on voluntarism and community-mindedness. So it sees the individual as part of a whole by default, rather than just as an island. So that's where it kind of differs from libertarianism or Ayn Randian objectivism, right? You also, hopefully, if you watch me, you know that I'm consistently skeptical, and as I've said, all of this stuff is tempered by pragmatism. And I'm using UK numbers for the most part, as I'm going to be talking here, because that's what I'm most familiar with and things that I know the reliability of. All right, so back to the argument. So that, as I said, the dichotomy that I keep being presented with is that somehow it's a choice between killing millions from the virus or killing millions from the shutdown through poverty and joblessness, suicide, and everything else that results from that. This is, I believe, a false dichotomy, and I want to demonstrate that. The idea behind it is the idea that joblessness and poverty, and henceforth all the things that go along with deep poverty, like starvation and so on, will kill more people than the virus ever could, or at least more people now than the virus will. Now, globally speaking, we have a tentative mortality rate of around 3%. It ranges anywhere from 2% to 5%. Most authoritative sources are saying it's 3 point something percent, but we'll take the lower bound of 3%, the lower bound of the average. And the virus, if completely unfought, has an infectivity rate of about 60%. So if we did absolutely nothing, about 60% of the globe would end up being infected, and about 3% of those people who were infected would die if we did absolutely nothing. So in the UK, that would amount to around 2 million deaths. Now, with everything that we've done, we've reduced that to around 30,000 official deaths and about 60,000 total deaths so far, but the infection is still ongoing. But that just demonstrates to you exactly how effective things have been, that we've managed to cut things down that much, and we are now past the peak unless we make a huge mistake. But this provides us with a ballpark figure of what an acceptable number of deaths would be from other consequences, right? So if it's a choice between 2 million deaths from the virus and 150,000 deaths from economic woes, well, clearly we should impose the economic problems, right? That's just trolley problem statistics, basically. Grim statistics, the grim calculus of deaths. And it's hard to visualize even thousands of deaths. As Stalin said, death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. It's hard to wrap your head around, because we only really relate to about 100 or so people. So think of it as 3 people it's 3%. About 2 people dying, if that helps you relate to it. Now, we're not completely without statistics on the mortality effect of poverty. So in the UK, which is obviously is a developed country, austerity, which we had 10 years of under the Tories, which led to massive food insecurity and other problems, that killed about 150,000 people over the course of 10 years. So about 15,000 per year. So again, we can make a rather bald and morbid, cross-examination here, and we can say that, okay, 60,000 people have died so far in the UK, almost certainly from coronavirus. That's more than 15,000. So clearly, imposing economic problems in order to cope with the virus has, at least thus far, been the better choice, has led to less deaths. It is true that the United Nations has estimated that 150 million globally could die from the economic impact. It's also true that an unfought coronavirus would have killed about 90 million from older estimates. Newer estimates, it would be about 228 million globally. So again, the grim calculus would seem to indicate that of the two choices, if it was down to two choices, then we would have to choose to fight the virus at economic cost, because that results in less deaths overall. But this is if we did nothing. All right, so if we did nothing to fight the coronavirus, hundreds of millions would die. If we did absolutely nothing to fight these poverty conditions, 150 million people would die, right? But that's if we do nothing. We did something about coronavirus, and there's no reason we can't also do something about food insecurity and poverty and so on. And that something doesn't have to be at the expense of exposing our societies to even more virus deaths. It's a false dichotomy. Previous experience suggests that there will be a fairly rapid recovery from the economic impact of fighting COVID once we do open up, but this is only really going to be possible after a vaccine. Most estimates reckon the first operable vaccine would be about 18 months after the outbreak of the virus. So we're only about 6 months in. So we've got about another year. So next summer is when we should most likely see a vaccine. We might see something beforehand. Everyone's rushing. There's a huge global effort. We might see something before then, but 18 months. So we'd be looking at about here in the UK about 22, maybe 25,000 deaths resulting from poverty, resulting from fighting the coronavirus, which is still less than the amount of casualties we've already had. So again, through the grim calculus, the best option is already available. But we don't need to let anyone die from poverty. Again, this is a false dichotomy. Just as we fought the coronavirus, we can fight the effects of closing down our society and the free market. I mean, psychologically, people like to talk about suicide issues, but psychologically, this isn't like regular joblessness, right? In terms of psychological impact, suicides, etc., are less likely in this situation because it's not that you're a useless bastard who can't keep or maintain a job, right? It's something beyond your control. It's something you carry no blame for, and it can even be seen as patriotic and good for the people around you to stay home and not be working. Right? So the psychological impact is far less because there is a tangible, real reason that everybody accepts and understands and knows. Right? So we're unlikely to see as big of a spike in suicides. There have been some, sure, there are always going to be. It's always difficult to assign blame, but it's different. It's not like regular joblessness. Now, there's no need for anyone to starve in the midst of plenty. We have plenty. Farmers are pumping away milk down the drain because they've got no buyers for it, but then there are people who would want that. And farm workers, agricultural workers are deemed essential workers. Supply chain workers are deemed essential workers. They're already out there, they're already exposed. Bad for them. But again, this is part of the whole grim calculus of everything. People need food. Goods need to be transferred from one place to another. We should be making PPE and testing available to these people before everyone else, but it's there. But the point is that the food is there. What isn't there is people working and earning money to pay for the food. But that doesn't mean that we have to deny them food, right? There's no need for anyone to starve in the midst of plenty. And this is what seems to confuse people. They're so utterly stuck in this singular free market capitalist mode of thought that they can't conceive of the idea even of rationing or distribution during an emergency. But it's not like this is anything new. Rationing, this happened during World War Two and World War One to a lesser extent. We have tools available to distribute food, and they don't have to depend on the free market, and they don't have to completely collapse the economy either. You can pay workers, agricultural workers, farmers, and so on, a basic value for everything, and at least it's going to people who need it then, right? And then we can claw it back through taxation or other means later on. But it is absolutely not necessary for anyone to starve. We've got the food. What we don't have is the money to pay for the food necessarily as individuals for those people who are unable to work. But that's not the only paradigm by which goods and services can be distributed. There are others. The only issue here is money, and it's only an issue if we want it to be. If free market capitalism cannot cope with this situation, and it has people starving in the midst of plenty, I mean, it does normally, but this is an unusual circumstance, then it's not a suitable system in this time and place at this point, for all it can be a fairly good system at other times. This doesn't mean we should abandon any and all semblance of capitalism and embrace Marxism, which I don't advocate for anyway, but we do have past models such as rationing, where we distributed food and necessities outside of the market paradigm. And in fighting a virus like this is closer to a wartime paradigm. Right? There are shortages, there are problems, there are people removed from the workforce, as though they'd been drafted and sent off to war. So we have past models of how to deal with this, and they worked in that context tremendously well. Yeah, it worked so well during the war, command economies and rationing and all the rest of it, that many nations embraced the idea of centralization and command economies after the war. Now, it didn't have as good results outside of that context, just as the free market is failing now and led to a lot of problems, but the point is that it worked for the duration of the crisis. It ensured everyone was fed. There was no need for anyone to starve. There's no need for anyone to starve now, and we don't have the problem of U-boats sinking all the supplies coming from abroad this time. For all everyone keeps trying to invoke a Blitz spirit or Dunkirk in the aftermath of VE Day, they're failing the most obvious point of comparison and being rather selfish. So look, it's a false dichotomy. It's not one choice or the other. We can mitigate the damage from the virus, and we can mitigate the damage from poverty and the impact on the economy at the same time. There's no need for starvation in the midst of plenty. It is not a choice between the two. We can attack both problems at the same time and in similar ways until the crisis is over, and then we can lift these impositions and ways of dealing with things, and we can go back to something vaguely normal, but hopefully we can learn from all of this and we can actually improve things rather than continuing down the same path, which hasn't dealt with this very well at all. Now, the other side to this, and part of the reason I react so strongly to people trying to present me with this false dichotomy, is that this is also personal for me. I have very shit lungs. I had terrible childhood asthma. I only have something like 80 to 90% normal lung capacity, and I have bad allergies that fuck up my breathing. I have friends who are immunocompromised from their fights with cancer. I have friends who are immunocompromised from their disabilities, one of whom has already had the coronavirus and has suffered more permanent damage as a result of it. My parents are getting older. You're not just saying my right to a haircut or to go to work is worth deaths. You're saying you, Grim, can die for the sake of my convenience. And it's not just me, and the cost isn't just in terms of deaths. As we're starting to understand, there are all kinds of permanent damages or things that require physio and other long-term care in the medical system from infections with the coronavirus. So if you want to be particularly grim about it, you can say that, oh, wow, we're going to save a lot of money from all these people who've died in nursing homes. Yeah, but we're going to lose that on long-term care for a lot of other people. But yeah, it's personal as well, because I'm at risk. I'm at a high risk. So when you're saying these things, you're saying that me, I can die for your convenience, and I'm not up for that. And this is just as stupid as anti-vaccination arguments. You know, you're willing to put other people's kids at risk because some yoga mom on YouTube told you that vaccines contain aluminium and formaldehyde and mercury, right? It's extremely selfish. And most of the people proposing these arguments, oh, think of the poor, think of the working class, think of this, think of that, they normally don't give a shit about those people. So it's a disingenuous argument in the first place. Whereas I don't want them to be exposed any more than I want anyone else. So what's the alternative? How do we tackle this in an effective way? We redistribute food to those who need it and can't afford it. Those who can afford it continue to buy it at market rates and everything else. Those who can't, a ration, perhaps. That's one way of dealing with it. We already have, unfortunately, a huge existing network of food banks. The government could buy into that. Buy directly from the suppliers and dump a load of goods into the food bank chain and allow that to be distributed. That's just one way of handling it. That 150 million deaths that the UN talks about, that was if we did nothing. But we would have lost hundreds of millions of people globally if we'd done nothing about the virus, right? So these are warnings that we do something. We've mitigated the virus. We can mitigate the harm on the most vulnerable from the economic impact of fighting the virus, and it doesn't require sacrificing more people to the great and good invisible hand. It's a completely false dichotomy, and it only seems to be people who are ideologically captured that are talking about doing this, you know, sacrificing people for their convenience for the sake of a billionaire's bottom line. Right, that's really all I have to say on that. So I'm continuing to work on Grim Dark Rules for 5th edition and Whitechester. So that's going on. I've got a lot of art commissioned, but I'm kind of tapped out now. I've commissioned as much stuff as I can afford to with people to try and offset their harm from the economic impact of the virus. So, you know, I put my money where my mouth is, literally. So that should start trickling in, which is good. So those 2 Gorean adventures should be out relatively soon, and the Grim Dark Rules should be out relatively soon. So that's what I'm working on. One of the people who has been particularly belligerent about this argument that this video is about is the RPG pundit. So I'm rethinking my involvement in inappropriate characters. I don't think he's as racist or right-wing or whatever as people call him, and I think I provide a valuable counterpoint opinion on that podcast, on that stream. But this is like anti-vaccination, and do I really want to share a platform with someone who is anti-vaccination? Yeah, he's not, but I'm making the comparison there, because saying that other people have to die for the sake of the economy is, to me, as illogical, irrational, and not offensive. I mean, this isn't a matter of offense. I mean, it's deadly. It meets the demands of the harm principle. So, do I really want to continue to share a platform with someone who's advocating that other people die for a billionaire's bottom line? I don't know. I'm thinking about it. I mean, this too shall pass, and the exposure and so on there has been good for me, but well, if you watch me a lot, you know I'm principled to the extent that it often harms me. So I just don't know that I want to share a platform any longer with someone who is acting the moral equivalent of an anti-vaxxer. Yeah, so I'm thinking what to do with that. Obviously, I'm not going to flounce out and cause harm or damage to it. Him and Venger and whoever they would get to replace me would be, perfectly welcome. I've taken the first couple of steps necessary if I decide to hand the channel over to them, because I tend to do the back end stuff. We'll see. I'm still thinking about it. But I guess my point is, this is as dangerous as anti-vaccination rhetoric, and I would not choose to continue an association with someone who's anti-vaccination. So I've got to apply to some consistency here, but I need some emotional distance to process it all. So we'll see. The video output should be back to normal this week. That's about it. If no one's got any questions or comments, I see I haven't had many viewers today, but yeah, if anyone's got any questions or comments, I'll handle those. Otherwise, I'll toddle off and get back to work. I might make another version of this video as a recorded version for my main channel, where it'll get more traction. Nope. Anyone? Bueller? Okay. In that case, I think I will go and record another version of this that's not a live stream version, and put that up. Or maybe put it up tomorrow. Probably tomorrow. Alright, take care everyone. Remain indoors. Zang.